welcome to our latest episode of Points on the Circle. For this interview, I had the opportunity to talk with Stephen Schwartz. Stephen's been hanging out at HaKafa for quite a long time and has been a member for about 5 or 6 years. He is an expert in nuclear disarmament and a fantastic guy to have a great talk with, so I hope you enjoy it like I did. All right, so here we go. Stephen, it's great to see you. How you been?
Bruce, I'm fine. Things are going well, even amidst this late August heat wave.
How's Lily doing?
Lily's doing good. She just started school again on Wednesday, virtually, of course. If I was meeting, I'm going to ask her at dinner tonight, but my sense is that she likes having a little bit of structure back in her life.
She's a junior?
She's a junior now, yes. Last year she was abroad in France, and that was curtailed in March when COVID descended, and the school kind of freaked out after Trump made we're banning everybody from Europe, and they sent everybody home. So,
wow. You are the first person I have ever met who actually worked for Greenpeace at a time in the 1980s, when global warming, there was no climate change problem. Were you one of the people who chained yourself to trees or rode out in your human motored boats to occupy and hijack tankers? What was that about? What's it like working at Greenpeace?
You know, I always wanted to do those actions. And no, I oddly enough, I was the very first person Greenpeace USA hired as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. So I took action in the halls of Congress. I did not chain myself to any representatives or senators, nor did I do that at the White House. I don't think the Secret Service would have been very happy about that. But yeah, I went to Washington in '88 to work on nuclear policy issues, and Greenpeace was expanding very rapidly at that point. Thanks in part to the French sinking of their flagship, the Rainbow Warrior, in Auckland, New Zealand in 1985, which generated an enormous amount of attention and sympathy for the organization, and also when France paid a fair amount of money. So Greenpeace was growing hand over fist, and they of course were, well maybe not of course, people might not realize it, but Greenpeace was actually founded in 1971 to stop nuclear weapons testing in Alaska underneath Amchitka Island at the end of the Aleutian chain. And since then, of course, it's grown to encompass many other things, and it's better known for baby seals and global warming and pollution and all sorts of other whales, of course. But the founding issue was always nuclear. And when I went to Washington, they were expanding their nuclear program, and they wanted somebody to actually work in Congress to persuade members of Congress to do the right thing, as opposed to just chaining themselves to trees and dropping banners and so forth. So I did that for almost 4 years.
That's a long time to be a lobbyist.
It was a very frustrating time. It was the end of the first Bush administration, and then this was '88, so actually the end of the Reagan administration, and the first Bush administration went through the first Iraq War. It was interesting challenges, great, but I will say this, it was a great place for me to work. My second job out of college, a fantastic group of people, very young, very engaged, very motivated, and Washington was just a fantastic place to work. But butting heads in Congress was not a lot of fun, and I continued to lobby for another organization for 2 years after that. And then I sort of saw the writing on the wall. This is after Newt Gingrich took over the House, and the contract with America, more like
it was actually the contract on America.
On America, exactly. And it just became very, very hard. I mean, it's always difficult to persuade members of Congress to focus on these issues. It's not something most people spend any time thinking about. There may be a handful of members of Congress who, because there's a nuclear weapons facility or a base in their district, they've got a vested interest in it because of their constituents, but otherwise not. So it was a real challenge, and I decided to sort of move on to the sort of scholarly writing activism kind of thing and move away from the lobbying.
So tell us, well, first of all, I will curse George Bush the second one. for the purposes of this conversation, for no other reason, for not being able to pronounce nuclear correctly. So that every time now I have to think to make sure I'm not saying nuclear. So if that was enough reason for me to curse him. What's one example, one story that pops into your head about your experience of lobbying back then? And did you lobby Newt Gingrich? But those are two separate questions. So give us something that stands out, either positive and negatives, anything that happened.
Sure, sure. I did not lobby Newt Gingrich, and I don't actually recall running into him in the halls of Congress. Although, funny story, in the early 90s, I was dating a woman who knew somebody who worked at WETA, the PBS station in Washington, and they produced the big 4th of July televised celebration. And she, through that connection, got us tickets to the after party for that, which included, which was fantastic, a massive, wonderful buffet in the halls of Congress. And you could wander into the House of Representatives and go up right to the dais and sit in the speaker's chair and look at everything. So I did that, and I'm trying to remember whether Gingrich was the speaker at that time or not, but it's possible I sat where Newt sat. So
wow.
my small clip.
Back in '07, while President Obama was when he was campaigning, his office had been moved to the basement of Hart Building, and I was there with our sophomores for a week because we used to take them every year, and I just had 2 at that time or 3, and we were in his office with no one around, and one of his aides said, you can sit in his seat. So all the kids were like, "Wow, I can sit in Senator Obama's seat." Who knew, right? That's the big stuff. The big stuff.
Close to greatness. But no, you asked, so interesting story. So this goes to my time at Greenpeace. When I worked at Greenpeace from 88 to 92, the U.S. nuclear weapons production complex, which, as most people don't know, is run by the Department of Energy. This is all the facilities around the country that do the research and development, testing, and production of our nuclear bombs and warheads. And the whole complex was collapsing because of neglect, because nobody had bothered to really focus on putting in the right amount of money and attention to it. And so the Cold War was winding down, and these facilities were falling apart. And a lot of them actually shut down in the late 80s, and most of them never really restarted. And it was around this time that George H.W. Bush became president, and he decided to appoint an admiral to be the Secretary of Energy, Admiral James Watkins, and to sort of clean things up, turn things around, put the military in charge of this. And Admiral Watkins decided with the White House to nominate the then executive director of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to be the head of the Defense Programs Office, which was the office, the administrator that oversees all the weapons, all the bomb factories, essentially. And this guy's name was Victor Stello. And Victor was just bad news for the nuclear community. He was been around for a long, long time. And
for the anti-nuclear community.
pro-nuclear energy people, he was great because he would basically look the other way for environmental violations and safety violations. He would, try to steer the NRC in the direction of not interfering at all with nuclear energy producers. And the president, George H.W. Bush, and Admiral Watkins had said, we're going to make the environment number one. We're going to make health and safety number one. We're going to fix these problems, turn this around, and produce nuclear weapons safely and reliably again. And the person they picked was the exact opposite of who you would want to do that. So we got wind of this at Greenpeace, and I was between issues at that point. And this was in July or so, June or July of 1989. And I put out a press release under the Greenpeace name saying appointing Victor Stello as the head of the Defense Programs Office at the Department of Energy is like putting the Joker in charge of Gotham City. And this got picked up by the Associated Press and went across the country.
You went viral. We went
viral before viral was a thing. And we started a campaign. I created a coalition with a bunch of other groups, and we started a campaign to deny Victor Stello the nomination to run the program. And nobody had ever challenged anybody at this level. Nobody had really ever challenged the Secretary of Energy, anything at the Secretary of Energy level or the Department of Energy before. But we did it and we persevered and we raised a huge amount of questions about this guy. There were hearings, there were reports. The end result was that the Senate Armed Services Committee, which was charged with vetting Victor Stello, demurred and basically delayed, and they delayed long enough that they withdrew his nomination. He ended up getting promoted to it in an acting capacity. So he still had the job, but he couldn't do all the portions of it. And then he got in a horrible skiing accident a year or two later, and basically had to quit. And but it was a successful campaign. It really drew attention to the issues, and it denied the administration the person that they wanted.
Yay for you. Yay, that's fantastic. When we were working on the border issues with Tornillo, and we went and spent the weekend, we spent 4 days lobbying up in February of 19. And the work that went into that by members of Hakafah to prepare to be able to lobby successfully, and the amount of work that you just had to explain that you went through to get what we consider a victory. It's exhausting for that. I'm not minimizing. That's not a minimizing. Understanding the whole scope of what we try to do as people who fight for justice. Wow. Right. So let me ask you something. Go on.
No, it is a lot of work. And the important thing about any kind of work, whether it's nuclear or environmental or immigration or civil rights, whatever it is to pick your fights carefully. Pick something that is small enough that you can actually win it or attempt to win it in a reasonable period of time, but large enough that it really matters. Like, I mean, my goal, of course, I mean, my career, 35 plus years now, is to, broadly speaking, save the world and eliminate nuclear weapons, or at least—
Is that all?
at least reduce or eliminate the nuclear threat. But you have to bite off pieces of it, otherwise you'll burn out. And I mean, it's just, I never imagined that I would be doing this work this long, or that I would have a career at. I mean, my standard line I tell people is nobody's more surprised that I've been successful, both in terms of actually achieving something, but also being able to make a living. No one's more surprised other than my grandfather and my father, who had very, very different perspectives coming up when they did in the, let's see, my grandfather would have matured in the 20s and 30s, and my father in the 40s and 50s. They had a different idea of what a job would be, and I totally understand that. But it's important to sort of pick your battles carefully, and then build on them, and not keep the goal in mind, but don't attempt to achieve that all at once. Otherwise, when you fail, you'll go, I can't do it, and you'll move on to something else.
So I got two streams of questions that I want to go, and they're like this. So I think I'm going to go this way first, although I tend to go left whenever I can, but I'm going to. So I'm going to come back to the saving the world part, because I actually have some direct questions around that. I want to talk, given the fact of the amount of work you had to do for that one victory, and you have to choose your small victories when this is this whole pool, everything you just said, do you think that our democracy works?
Do I think? Wow, that is, you didn't tell me you were going to stump me.
I told you I didn't know what we were going to talk about.
I think it can work. I think it requires people to be knowledgeable and engaged, and it requires people on the government side of things who are willing to be engaged and learn about these issues and work on them. I mean, I think when it comes to nuclear weapons issues, the bureaucracy that is in charge of these things, both at the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, would very much prefer that people don't know about them and don't do anything about them, because the less you know, the less concerned you'll be. And the less concerned you are, the less you want to change things. And that's just fine with them, because as far as they're concerned, as long as the money keeps flowing and their contracts keep getting paid for, and they can do whatever they want to do without much interference, they're happy. I mean, they think that nuclear deterrence is working fine. They don't think that there's a terrible risk, or if there is a risk, it's manageable. They don't think it's unaffordable. They don't think that the long-term environmental and human health consequences are anything to be concerned about. So they don't want people like me and the people that I work with to be raising people's knowledge levels about this, because that just makes their job harder. like I said earlier, most members of Congress don't focus on these issues. Members of Congress have a very short-term focus. For a House of Representatives member, it's every 2 years. They got to get elected every 2 years and reelected. That's what they're working on. They're working on the budget. They're working on the crisis of the day. Senators, it's every 6 years, but it's essentially the same thing. Nuclear issues tend to slide by unless there's a crisis of some kind or an accident or some combination of events that requires people to pay attention. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was the collapse of the nuclear weapons complex and the end of the Cold War. On some other issues like nuclear energy, you have Fukushima in 2011. During the Cold War, there were any number of crises, the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 being the most obvious, but they're really just blips. And people don't want to think about and don't want to worry about nuclear. It seems unsolvable. It's like literally the end of the world, and it's the attitude is basically, I don't know anything about that. I can't get involved. Therefore, I'm going to put it out of my mind because if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it's not, there's nothing I can do about it. And that's just wrong. And it's a challenge to engage people, to get them to want to get engaged. And it's similarly, just because members of Congress and the government are people too, it's hard to get them engaged. So does it work? Not as well as it should. Can it work? Absolutely. And I'm hoping that when all of the crises that we're dealing with right now are in the rearview mirror, and hopefully the not too distant future.
Yeah, soon they're going to be, everything's going to be better, right? All the problems are going to be gone, right? Go ahead.
Well, it's just, it's very, right now, it's very challenging to work on these issues because obviously, first of all, nuclear is not something that touches most people. Even during the Cold War, I mean, sure, some people were affected by fallout from nuclear testing in Nevada. You had atomic veterans that were exposed.
Sure.
A missile might blow up from time to time and there'd be an accident, or a plane would crash or whatever. But most people, you're not affected. Civil rights issues, environmental issues, voting rights, and name any other issue that will affect you personally. Crime, whatever. Nuclear does not. And so most people don't come to the world thinking this is something that I need to be engaged in and aware and involved in, or it's national security somebody else should be dealing with. So it can work. It should work better, and it's part of my job and my colleague's job to make sure that it does.
Well, so I find it fascinating that everything that I've asked you so far, you've brought it back to nuclear issues. I mean, now granted, I talked about Greenpeace and I just talked about democracy, but it talks to me, what that says is you are so, your world is so engulfed, encompassed, your life is so invested in this issue of nuclear.
I live and breathe, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying this in a positive kind of way. And I also love that, parenthetically, everybody, right before we started 10 minutes late because Stephen's mother called, or to call him back, because he had a question that he knew I was going to ask, because I didn't know I was going to ask this, is where did this passion come from? What is it that this so engulfed you that you eat, sleep, breathe it? Kind of like I eat, sleep, and breathe Judaism. You do that around nuclear stuff.
Right. Well, it is a passion of mine.
How'd that happen?
I do remember vividly in college turning many people off because I was so passionate and engaged.
Wait a minute, you went to Santa Cruz. You were talking about issues of imports, and this was around 3 Mile Island, wasn't it?
I went to school from 83 to 87, so it was a little after that. But.
Yeah, so, and people got sick. I love it. The slugs got sluggish about an issue. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I would go around with pins on my shirt, nuclear arms, or you can't hug a child with nuclear arms, and, you can't simultaneously prepare and prevent for nuclear war, all these wonderful, I should have brought some out for today. And, but I was so passionate about it, and people were like, we get it, Steve. We get it. It's important, but there's this party happening. We should go to this party. And I don't want to leave the impression. I mean, I had a good time at college too. Don't get me wrong. But that's where this passion of mine really developed. But it started before that. It started in probably my awakening to issues was probably about 1979, 1980. Jimmy Carter was president. the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and there was talk about reviving the draft. And I wasn't draft age, but I was getting close. And I started paying attention because I really didn't want to be drafted. And I decided after doing a lot of research and reading that I would be a conscientious objector. So when I had to register, I wrote on the form, I'm a conscientious objector and I will refuse to serve. I still have a copy of it somewhere. I did register, but I sent it in. And for many years, I was concerned. I mean, particularly when Reagan was president, he never really quite knew what was going to happen, you know, particularly during his first term. And I didn't want to go off and kill people. I mean, I felt like if I had to defend myself personally, you know, if you broke into my home and were threatening me, I would take whatever measures were necessary. But I'm not going to go out on a battlefield somewhere or sit in a silo and push a button or something like that. That was just abhorrent to me. So that was sort of my initial awakening about my role in the world and what might happen to me if I didn't pay attention. And then a couple of different things happened. One is that the synagogue that we belonged to, Leo Beck Temple, the head rabbi there, Leonard Bierman, along with George Regas, who was the reverend at All Saints Church in Pasadena, California, in 1979, founded the Interfaith Center to reverse the arms race. Leo Beck was a very political place, thanks to Rabbi Bierman and also Rabbi Reagan's, the associate rabbi. And that rubbed off on me. When I was little, you know, we would go to services and it was so boring.
No, it was not. No, it was not. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's certain things I liked. I mean,
No, of course, I get it. I'm kidding. I
sing
get
the
it.
songs, but you know, the rabbi would get up there. But at a certain age, possibly as early as late junior high, but certainly in high school, I started paying attention to the sermons. They were extremely political, and they often involved talking about war and peace issues, and nuclear came up. And that, plus my mother getting involved in something called the Thursday Night Group, which was an educational organization that, let's say you were interested in or concerned about these issues, you wanted to know more, you would invite a group of friends and family, maybe coworkers even, to come to your house. A Thursday night group facilitator would show up. This was in the VCR era. They would have a videotape of a documentary, short documentary, and there were a lot of documentaries around at the time. They would show it, and then they would facilitate a conversation about it. You know, how does this make you feel? What are you concerned about? And it wasn't geared toward driving people in one direction or another. It was really trying to raise awareness and get people to break through what psychologist or psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton called psychic numbing, that we tune this out because it is so horrendous and so beyond us that we would just not, you know, we just said we can't deal with it. And the idea was to foster more communication, get people to see that even though you may not agree eye and everything, maybe you share certain perspectives. My mother became a facilitator. I did the training. I went off to school. I got hooked up with a program on campus, the Adlai Stevenson program on nuclear policy, took classes, became a TA, and ultimately skewed my entire undergraduate education toward nuclear policy issues. And it just because it both intellectually fascinated me, you know, how did these weapons work and where were they and how would the president authorize, you know, the use of nuclear weapons and what would happen after that, but also horrified me. And then I decided I want to get involved, and it became this wonderful place where I could learn about it and teach others and also do something about it. And I did some amazing things while I was there, actually, and not far from campus, just up the road, was a Lockheed, now it's Lockheed Martin, but Lockheed Missiles and Space, that built part of the Trident II submarine launched ballistic missile. And they were in Santa Cruz County, and they wanted to expand their facility to build more of these missiles. And they went to the planning commission for the Santa Cruz City Council and said, we need your permission to expand this factory. And several groups around town decided to protest this. And I think this was probably the very first thing I did. This was probably 84 or 85. So maybe I was a sophomore. I testified twice. I remember it was a big auditorium downtown. And I talked about, a lot of people talked about, you know, you're going to cut down trees or whatever. I talked about what a nuclear war would do to Santa Cruz and to the campus. And we won. The planning commission, planning council denied the permit. Didn't stop Lockheed. I mean, they built the missile somewhere else. I think they went to Sunnyvale and did it, but it didn't happen in Santa Cruz. And a lot of people would have said, and there were some conservative people in Santa Cruz, well, what about jobs? What about the revenue it would bring in? It's like, well, that's true, but what about the devastation that this would cause? I mean, you have to take a stand somewhere. And it just went on from there. And you might be aware, because we're basically the same age. This was around the time there was a lot of activism on campus. Brown University started an initiative, I think they called it the Suicide Pill Initiative, where students put in an initiative on a ballot one year that in the event of a nuclear war, the campus should distribute cyanide pills to the students so that in order to avoid a lingering death from radiation.
Wow. No, I don't remember that at all.
You would take these pills. So a bunch of friends of mine and I brought this idea to Santa Cruz, and we put it on the ballot, and it was the most debated thing on campus ever. And it drew a huge, I mean, I think more people voted that year than on anything else. It lost by a very little bit, but the chancellor at the time was impressed and allowed a group of us to basically create a pamphlet about nuclear weapons that would be distributed to freshmen and all students actually, for several years. So it really did raise awareness about these. A lot of people thought we were being nihilistic. You know, why would you want to die? It's like, do you realize what a nuclear war would do? This was at the time when the Reagan administration was doing something called crisis relocation planning, which was the latest version of duck and cover, and that you would basically evacuate the cities and move toward the countryside. And our idea was that the campus should provide vehicles that would take us to San Francisco,
to the city,
to ground zero, because we didn't want to be around after the bombs exploded.
That's really intense for a 20-year-old. No wonder people didn't want to talk to you. Oh my God.
Hey, you know, college, yeah, I was a very intense person at that time, and I learned to dial it back a little bit because I didn't want to.
Is this what happens at your dinner table with Lynn? I mean,
I'm not like that now. I'm really not like that. You know, it's funny. Years later, when I was working for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you know, the folks with the symbolic doomsday clock that brought me to the Chicago area 22 years ago now. I was on a plane going somewhere, and I was reading the latest issue of the Bulletin. This was back when it was actually a physical magazine. And as you were wont to do on airplanes, the woman next to me was sort of looking over. We had a very attractive magazine, lots of graphics and cartoons, and she's looking, and then maybe she saw the cover, and she said, you know, well, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a nuclear weapons policy expert. And she like physically recoiled and did not talk to me for the rest of the flight. So, I mean, that's all I said. I'm not a horrifying, scary person, and I wasn't going to proselytize on the plane unless, you know, somebody was really interested. But again, most people don't want to think about this. It's just it's too much. It's too distracting. It's too big.
So that's the next place. That, you know, when I said I had 2 ways to go, I now have 2 more ways to go, but I'm going to go with the first way. And that is, so yeah, there's a lot of numbness around that. My relationship to this particular issue is, I want to know that atomic clock, right? That they set the time, how close we are to destruction. I remember in the Clinton years, it was moved the farthest. Was it the Clinton or the Obama? It was the Clinton years. It was moved the farthest back ever, like till 1:45. And now we're like at 47 seconds to midnight. Using that as metaphor.
It's 100 seconds. Not quite so bad.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, so right. Is it, not is it accurate, but I mean, where are we in terms of this issue, in terms of the future of humanity?
We're at something of a crossroads, and what happens next depends in no small part on whether Donald Trump gets reelected in November. We have made great progress over the years. The clock did turn, again, the clock is just symbolic. A kid asked me once, because we used to take the clock out and do talks and, you know, tour around in high school and even younger kids. And somebody said, well, can't you just move it backwards and eliminate the threat? And I said, I wish it were that.
Just take the batteries out.
Just take the batteries out, yeah. Or no, the hands were only moved by human hands, you know. And we used to joke that we'd go up to the office, the attic where we kept the clock, and we'd move it around and make the world less safe or more safe. But that's not really how it works. I mean, it reacts to events it doesn't anticipate.
Of course.
And you know, but we made huge amounts of progress. I mean, at one point, when I was becoming first active in these issues, we probably had about 60,000 nuclear weapons around the world. Now we have fewer than 15,000. It's still 15,000.
Yeah, thank God, because yeah, really, I mean, that's not going to destroy the world. It'll only destroy the world 30 times over, not 60 times. But go ahead.
But we've made, you know, we were testing nuclear weapons regularly, underground, all over the world, and we're not, you know, except for North Korea, periodically, we're not doing that anymore. We haven't built a new nuclear weapon in the United States since 1990. So I mean, we're still spending far too much money, tens of billions of dollars, and we're on track to spend at least $1.2 trillion over the next several decades, essentially rebuilding the entire arsenal, which is something that President Obama actually began near the end of his administration as a way to try to get a nuclear arms control treaty ratified by the Senate, a treaty that Donald Trump seems determined to destroy. The only treaty that's left, by the way, to constrain what the United States and Russia are doing with their nuclear weapons. So we've made a lot of progress, but it could all turn around. You know, there were a lot of countries that were interested in nuclear weapons at one point that decided not to pursue them, partly because of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which celebrated its 50th anniversary this year, partly because diplomacy persuaded them not to. But if we start, you know, brandishing our nuclear weapons, and if the sort of low key arms race that is now bubbling up to the surface again between the United States and Russia takes off, you know, more countries, just because, you know, not only 9 countries have nuclear weapons today, but there's not a rule that says only 9 can have them. Many countries have pursued it and then decided not to. So it's not a given, just like it's not a given that our democracy, you know, will continue to exist simply because it has existed for 200 plus years. It requires regular care and feeding. It requires civic engagement. It requires lawmakers to pay attention to the rule and not become lawbreakers. It's similar with nuclear, except the stakes are, you know, the whole world and not just, you know, one country. So things could go bad quickly. They could also get better relatively quickly, but it requires the right people in the right places at the right time. And it also requires, I think, quite frankly, an engaged public, because very little of the good things that have happened on nuclear issues have happened because government leaders have simply decided, oh, I think I'll do this.
Right.
It's because the public forced them.
Well, that's any issue. That's any issue. And that's what we see being played out right now with Black Lives Matter and civil rights, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. But it's harder on nuclear, though, because nuclear is tied up with national security and the fate of the country. And, you know, if you knew what I knew, you would support this and all of that. So it is a challenge. But here we are. You know, this is the 75th anniversary of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this month. And we've made a lot of progress, but we're not by any means out of the woods.
So it gets back to that whole Washington right conversation, and is our democracy working? And I mean, that's another question is, right, people want to trust our government. People want to be told that everything's going to be okay. And if you have someone in office whom you trust saying that, we want to believe that. And so if someone who's in power gets up and says, you don't know what I know, and if you did, then we are more apt to take a step back. Right. And so that's to your point. These issues are so far removed with all these other immediate issues that we're dealing with, that when it comes to national security, which translates to my personal security, I need to know that someone's going to be protecting me. And if that's what it takes, right. So that's what I hear you saying.
Right. No, that's true. And I would be the first to say, I mean, I've become much more engaged with and cognizant about a lot of other issues that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. You know, pandemics, civil rights, any number of immigration. I mean, all the things that we're worried about under the Trump administration, and fully recognizing that those have direct, immediate impacts on far more people than nuclear. But then I look at the nuclear issue and the tens of billions of dollars that we're spending on that, money that could be put to much better, more productive use if it were spent on really literally anything else. And, so this is sort of my piece of the world. I don't, work on this exclusively, but it's where I've decided to focus, most of my efforts. And I recognizing that lots of other people are working on all those other issues. Relatively few people are in the nuclear policy in this country and around the world.
How do you feel about Israel having nuclear weapons?
I would prefer that no country had nuclear.
I get that. You're going to say the right answer. And
Israel is, well, a lot of people used to talk about the nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. There are no right hands. Donald Trump has the ability, right, any president, but this one in particular has the ability at any time of the day or night to authorize a nuclear attack, and nobody has to agree with him, and nobody can really legally stop him apart from mass insubordination, or mutiny. So this whole system is trained to carry out the president's orders and to carry them out extremely quickly. It's a vestige of the Cold War, but it continues on today, in part because people are just not engaged with it, and also because the military just seems to think that we're still at risk of a surprise nuclear attack from Russia or North Korea or whoever. So, I do not worry about, I was truly concerned back in the 80s when I was first getting started. I mean, I remember planes going overhead and thinking, I wonder if that's a nuclear bomber. I mean, I remember watching The Day After live on television in 1983 in a completely silent dorm lounge after the bombs went off.
the last time I ate a Clark bar, because that's what he goes and eats because he's hungry. I think it's a Clark bar he gets out of the candy machine, right? Do you remember that scene where he had nothing else to eat? I think they were Clark bars. I think that was the last time I ate one, but go ahead.
I remember it was a visceral feeling, like you never really knew what Reagan was going to do or what the Soviet Union was going to do. I mean, or the early 80s in particular were incredibly tense time. And, slowly Reagan had a change of heart, and then Gorbachev came into power, and that was crucial. It wasn't all Ronald Reagan at all, but I do give him credit for changing. And, things began to move in the opposite direction. The doomsday clock started to move backwards, but it was a very dicey time. So I don't worry about, at any given moment in time, there could be a nuclear attack, but there could be. Our nuclear posture is still basically, if the president gives the order, 5 minutes later, the weapons are gone. And unless they're on a plane, they can't be recalled. That still is the case. So I'm not so much worried that we're going to deliberately start a nuclear war. I'm worried that, Donald Trump or somebody else is going to say something or tweet something that is going to lead to something happening inadvertently, which could lead to an accident, which is still a very real concern. So
I need a drink.
That's where I am.
So that whole idea. So the question about Israel then is, I kind of thought that's where you'd go with it, right? Is that no country should have them, right? So there's an issue with that. I was wondering because of that balance of various interests. So I'm actually going to jump back now a completely different way based on something you said about growing up at Leo Beck.
I didn't really answer your question, though.
I know you did, but come back to go ahead, give me the answer, and then I'll jump. Go ahead. I thought you did that purposefully. I was going to allow you out of it.
Just because I'm Jewish doesn't mean that I support Israel having nuclear weapons. I mean, I think it is, the way that we have warped our policy about nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation to allow Israel to have nuclear weapons. It has created incentives for Iraq, Iran, Syria, other countries in that region, and other countries just generally. If we have one rule for the rest of the world and one rule for your ally, it doesn't work. And I'm grateful that Israel doesn't parade its nuclear weapons around and brandish them. I mean, I think the opaqueness of their policy, I think, is wise, I guess is a word I might use. It doesn't mean I support it. But the fact is that it's out there, and it continues to be a danger, and it continues to be hypocritical of us not to address it. But I understand all the political reasons why we don't. So I prefer that they don't. I would prefer that lots of other countries don't, but it's a reality. And I don't think that, sort of pretending that, just skirting the issue doesn't help us in that region or in the rest of the world when it comes to reducing tensions and reducing the weapons overall. So, but it's a complicated one. It's definitely not, an easily solvable issue.
And that's one of the ones that when you've got that sense of, we were talking about before, you want to know that you're being protected and safe. And that was always part of the Israel mythology, right? Is that Israel would never use them, but the country was safe, quote unquote. And whatever that means, knowing that they had them, even though they didn't, it was never the opaqueness, to your point. Right.
Right. Well, here's the thing about nuclear deterrence. It works until it doesn't. And you will not, and when it stops working, that's it. And they are in a situation just like India and Pakistan are, where if somebody fires a nuclear weapon at them, they're going to have very little time to react, and vice versa if it's used within the region, which means they've got to be kind of ready to go. Now, my understanding is that their weapons are not, for the most part, armed all the time like ours are. It's just the knowledge that they're capable of it and ready to do it. And then, of course, the 800-pound gorilla of the United States is gonna back them up. But it's a very, if having those weapons and even quietly brandishing them encourages other countries to develop a counter, an arsenal of their own to counter that, that doesn't make either side safe. It's the appearance of safety, not actual safety.
It amazes me the amount of time, money, and effort that goes into killing each other instead of building each other up. That sounds so Pollyanna-ish, but that's just so at the heart of all this. Look at the time and money and brain power that goes to implementing devices to effectively kill one another.
Right. No, Martin Luther King said years ago, we have guided missiles and misguided men. And it's true. We've spent an inordinate amount of time and money making sure that we can utterly destroy anybody in the world with nuclear weapons. And yet somehow we can't get lead-free water in Flint, Michigan, or name any other issue.
So you're taking me now back my other way that I want to go, because you talked about Leo Beck. So you're bringing up all these questions, and you mentioned that it was a very political place. First of all, define for me, when you talk about a synagogue, what a political place means, and then talk about, do you think that that houses of worship, that religious places should be what you call political?
So what do I mean by Leo Beck being political? Well, I mean that the membership was very engaged. I remember one of the big things we did at the time, that there was always a big annual walk for Israel around the time of the anniversary of Israel's founding. Sometime in the spring, there was a big walk. I don't think they do it anymore. I'm not sure why, but I can speculate. But it would be, there would be thousands of people walking across parts of Los Angeles to celebrate Israel's, anniversary, and we would do that as a synagogue.
Always on Sunday, so you could get out of Sunday school. That's one reason, but go ahead.
It was probably yeah. But what else? I mean, so the membership was just very engaged. I mean, we had a food bank. We would talk about Cesar Chavez and the great boycotts, and I mean, whatever the political. I mean, I guess we were. I don't like the term, but I guess we were social justice warriors before that became a thing. Before anybody knew that, that was like a thing. I mean, it was the right thing to do. I mean, we live in the world, and
so why do you call that political and not prophetic?
Prophetic.
I mean, that's what the prophets were talking about. That's what being a religious person within all the text talks about, is about being engaged in the world and with each other, right? And so that's why I was asking you to define it, because I tend to think, right, and I didn't ask the question so I could preach. I kind of think that the issues we care about only become political to someone when they disagree with them. Or unless you had a different definition of it. That's why I said. So if you're talking about, well, we lobbied, we endorsed candidates, we did all, maybe. Right. I mean, right. But in terms of being involved with a food bank, that's just social action. That's, right. Talking about Chavez and issues of worker justice, that's the book of Jacob. I mean, the story of Jacob. But go ahead, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. Maybe I'm using the term incorrectly. It was maybe socially engaged or active or whatever the term is. The idea was that the ethos of the synagogue, and not always, but frequently, the sermons, certainly on the high holidays, frequently on regular Shabbats, and Shabbat Shalom, by the way. It
So
was,
this is, by the way, we're recording this on Friday, not Saturday. Go ahead. Go ahead.
but we, yeah, it's it kosher to say it before it's actually passed.
Yeah, of course. Oh yeah, of
Okay,
course.
so all right, good.
The
Good.
rabbis start preparing on Thursday morning, so you're good.
Okay, okay. But I guess what I mean is that the topics of discussion, and this would extend to even, like my mom was the member of a Torah study group on Sundays. So when I was maybe too old for Sunday school, but I was still probably going to confirmation class, but that would be during the week. I would accompany her to temple and make great bagels and cream cheese and whatever. And I would sit in on the Torah discussions, and it would of course be about whatever the portion was they were talking about, but it would often steer back to whatever was going on in the world. So it was, I guess what I really mean is more about, like, it was not apart from the world, but we were a part of it. So whatever was going on, whether it was civil rights or boycotts or something, about the nuclear arms race or whatever it would be, it would become a topic of discussion because it was of interest to and a passion of both of our rabbis and also I think a majority of the members of the synagogue. So when I started, when I left and made my way in the world, I was always looking for that kind of place. And I haven't really quite found it. You're close. And other places in Virginia where we lived for a while were similar, but not identical. But Leah Beck was just very unique in that respect. And there were probably a bunch of things that made me who I am. Certainly if I had not gone to UC Santa Cruz, if I had not become part of the nuclear policy program at that time, I would not be doing that. I went to school to study film. I was going to do special effects and sound effects. I mean, I was going to do that. And then I got sidetracked into nuclear weapons policy before the end of my first year. If Leo Beck had been a different place, if it had been in strictly religious, not from a conservative or orthodox standpoint, but if it hadn't addressed or engaged with any of these issues, I wouldn't have probably paid attention. I mean, my parents were certainly my mother certainly more than my father, but more engaged, and being aware of and engaged with the world was something that was instilled in me from a fairly early age. But all these things combined to make me the nuclear policy person I am today. So.
We had this really interesting conversation around our 36th anniversary when it became apparent that we were not going to be in person. This was back in March and April. And we decided to kick off the 36 for 36 campaign that we did, that if anyone donates $36, as you know, because you donated, right,
Yeah.
that we'll match it. And the question came up that we struggled with a little bit was, what if someone at Hakafa wanted to donate to the NRA? Or to an anti-choice campaign, or to any kind of thing that is what people would perceive would be an anathema to Hakafa's gestalt. Would we spend that $36? Would we do that? And so we ultimately decided that what is the value of our congregational community? Yes, it's about being in the world, being engaged, being on the ground, being involved in justice intimately, preaching less about it than we used to, but praying with our feet with it more, if I can say that. But we're also a democracy, talking about it, that everybody has a voice. And do we have a right to say that any congregant's value, right, is any less of a value that we should support than anybody else's? So ultimately, we decided that if someone wanted to donate to an anti-choice campaign, that the spirit of collectiveness is more important in this particular instance than what is the perception of who we are. Because if you ask anyone in the area who knows Hakafa, which is most people who don't, they think that we're either that hippity-dippity congregation, that guitar-playing congregation, or the anti-gun hippie nuts, right? I mean, that's a lot of the stuff that people think. So let me ask you, in that instance, right, which do you value more? Do you value the fact that a congregational community sticks by justice, whatever that means, principles, some of which you mentioned, or is that community and validating the community, the individuals in the community, more important?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's why you're the rabbi and I'm not.
No, but you're a member, you're the driving force of this. This is why
Right.
I asked you this, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about our community.
I think, anytime any group of people, whether it's a congregation or any kind of organization, becomes too uh, insular or too unwilling to engage with other viewpoints, it becomes a danger. I mean, I think there are probably certain issues that are, I don't know, inviolable. Is that the right word? I mean, I don't know. Let's just take what happened in Kenosha. I mean, should we support armed vigilantes going around doing whatever the hell they want? I would hope not. I would hope that would be kind of a clear, bright line for everybody, but apparently it's not. But I think it's possible to have differences of opinion about abortion, about immigration, about nuclear. I mean, God knows there's plenty on nuclear, and still be able to talk about it. And that was the whole, I mean, to kind of bring it back to where I started, that was the whole thing about my mother's involvement with the Thursday night group. It wasn't about preaching and proselytizing. It wasn't about hammering into people that you have to be against this. It was about, these are important issues. These are concerns that people have. These are the facts. Now let's discuss it. Let's see if we can find some common ground. We're all interested in security. We just maybe have different ways of defining it and how to achieve it. I can agree with you that this might not be the best way, and you can agree with me that this might be a problem, or this might be okay. Let's see what we can build on that. So I would hope that there's a way to, I sound like I'm trying to sort of toe the line here, but that there's a way to make sure that you can be inclusive, but yet still have some principles about certain things where, I mean, if somebody wanted to, I can't think of something off the top of my head now, but that you would basically draw a line, but certain things, but most things would be okay.
There's a lot of gray, right? And too much. One of my stepping back from, I used to speak a lot more strongly about these issues at the high holidays. And I mean, I still talk about it on Friday nights a lot, but one of the reasons I've tried to step back is because I feel like if all I'm doing is validating what the majority of the people are already feeling, then I am just adding to the echo chamber instead of challenging it. And it's very easy to get up and say what I know you all want to hear. Right? That's very easy. And that all it does is you come away then feeling validated. And I'm not demeaning validation. But at one point, if that's all we're doing, then how are we being Talmud? That's more like being Torah or halacha, which is more kind of directed, where Talmud is to expose the grayness and the conversation aspect of it, instead of the guy that you had paid to stand in front of you to talk for 20 minutes on Rosh Hashanah is saying something that you're going to walk away saying, yes.
I don't really look at it. I guess I don't really look at it that way. I never felt like, when I listen to you or when I listen to other rabbis that have preached something, about contemporary politics or the state of the world, I never felt like it was validating necessarily. I felt like it was you collectively were using your position to make us aware of something that maybe we hadn't really fully thought through or hadn't thought about enough, or would really prefer not to think about, but you're going to make sure that we do because it's important to the congregation and to the world at large in which we exist. I never really, I don't like people telling me what to do, but I've never felt like anything I've ever heard you say was telling me what to do. It was more like, this is important to me. And you've certainly gotten very emotional about some stuff, and I think that's completely appropriate. I think it actually helps to a certain degree to get the message across, because we collectively in this congregation, I mean, it's just so easy to, I mean, I don't want to generalize too much, but just thinking about my immediate and sort of larger family, we are dealing with the current COVID situation relatively easily. Okay, Lily's school year abroad got terminated early, but she came home and she's fine, and we have the space to do it, and we have all the internet connections where she can go to school, and we can, I don't, and I have the kind of job, I don't have a regular job at the moment, so I don't have to worry about being laid off. And we're very fortunate. And it's just very easy to not think about what's going on with other people. But it hits me every single day. People talk about the cities are in flames. Or like, first of all, I worked on a tough side of Chicago down on the University of Chicago campus for a number of years and bordered by some very unsavory neighborhoods. And when I was in Washington, D.C., similarly, I lived and worked in some areas that were pre-gentrification, were really tough. I remember my parents coming to visit me once, not long after I moved, and I was living in across the street from a homeless shelter in a really dicey part of town, but it was close to the Greenpeace office, and it was cheap, and cheap was important. Mm-hmm. And there were drug sweeps regularly. You would hear gunshots from time to time. The big park nearby, which is now quite a pride of the neighborhood, was drug infested. And they came and visited. We weren't there much at night, but they could see what was going on. And God bless them, they did not say a thing. I could tell that they were probably a little concerned. I was concerned, but they didn't freak out about it. I was their son, and I was fine, and it was going to be okay. But it was, I remember, to your point, when I moved to Washington, I moved from the west side of Los Angeles. I like to say that I lived in Brentwood before O.J. Simpson made it infamous. And it was a pretty cloistered existence. For a long time, I used to assume everybody I met was Jewish. That was never, ever true. When I was really little, my mother used to take us, and we would stay with a woman that used to be kind of not a nurse, but a nanny for us when we were little, a wonderful African-American woman named Laz, who lived in Compton. And my parents would go off and take short vacations, and they would leave us with her at her house in Compton. We're surrounded by little black kids and whatever, and it never occurred to me. I didn't think about the world in those terms. But when I moved to Washington, I suddenly realized how white I was, but in a good way. And it was really instructive and eye-opening.
Well, let me just clarify that you realize that when you say in a good way, you were talking about that you realized it, not that you were white in a good way. I want to just make sure you realized in a good way.
I realized that my experience to that point in time was not the necessarily majority experience, or certainly not the experience of the majority of the people in Washington, D.C. And it was helpful and good and enlightening to move around a city that's majority black, and just know and to recognize that, and not be, just to treat it as normal, and not to be worried about it, and to cross the street, or certainly parts of DC now, obviously, and even then were not great, but it was just a fact of life. And these were people, and this was their city, not mine. I was moving there, to work at a very white organization, although it did become less white over time. And it was eye-opening. So I was glad to have that experience.
So listen, we've been talking almost an hour, and we could keep going. So I need you to promise me something, as I'm going to have to bring that. I'm stopping in mid-sentence, and I hate that. But here's what I want you to promise me. I want you to promise me that as soon as we can, that we get together again in person and continue this conversation in person. There was a reason I reached out to you, because I have always just found you so incredibly compelling, so incredibly wise and thoughtful. So I appreciate that I had the opportunity to share that with other folks of Hakafa, and I hope that you'll have the opportunity to see some folks in person and get a reaction to this conversation. So that's one thing I want you to promise me, is that we'll get together. And,
yes.
And the other thing I want you to promise me is that you hug your wife and daughter for me, because I would love to see them sometime too, if that's okay.
Well, she's probably Zooming some class right now. Hopefully we're not interfering with her ability to do
Well,
that.
if we do, then oh well. So let me just say to everybody, that concludes this episode of Points on the Circle, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for being here.